Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jocelyn Bell Burnell. I'm the current president of the Royal, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome everyone here for this evening's event. The Royal Society of Edinburgh, we used to describe ourselves as Scotland's National Academy, but academy has taken on other meanings in the educational world. We are a body of some 1,500 or 1,600 fellows, leaders of all the intellectual areas, professional leaders, civil leaders, and using our expertise and convening power, we aim to support Scotland, promote Scottish things, enable things in Scotland. And the Royal Society of Edinburgh and the University of Edinburgh have collaborated in having a bust of Neil MacCormick sculpted by Kenny Hunter. And I would now like to invite Lady Flora MacCormick to unveil the bust, which is in the corner, and then invite Professor Neil Walker, Regius Professor of Law, to say a few words. So, happy to unveil it, ma'am? Thank you very much. Wow. Yeah. Wonderful. And could I invite Professor Neil Walker, who succeeded Neil MacCormick as Regius Professor of Public Law, to say a few words.
Okay. Thank you very much, Madam President. I just left Neil 20 minutes ago at the David Hume Tower, which is where the first of the busts sculpted by Kenny is to be found. Just to give you some background, this is a project which is said is a collaboration between the University of Edinburgh and the Royal Society. And the plan is to have two sculptures actually facing each other at Edinburgh University. We only have one so far, but he's feeling lonely, so he's going to be joined by a second. And we have one here, and hopefully in time there'll be a fourth one which will find its home at the National Portrait Gallery. I think it's a wonderful piece. It's one which was, it's all Kenny's work, but Flora and I like to think we contributed a little bit by having long conversations with Kenny about the man and about trying to somehow convey the sense of him. I think it's amazing that someone who never actually met Neil MacCormick was able to somehow portray him in such a wonderful way. Kenny said when he was introducing the other bust on Friday that he thought of Neil as someone who wasn't so concerned with external appearances. That doesn't sound as bad as it comes across. I think what he meant was he's someone who the inner self is very, very well expressed externally. And I think that's true, and I think he's captured that wonderfully well. For those of you who don't know, and I suppose most of you do, Neil was a man of many talents. Of course, we knew him very much in the academic context, a well-known and internationally renowned legal theorist. Also very, very prominent in Scottish public life and a very prominent member of the Scottish National Party, indeed a member of the European Parliament for one stint. But also he was very, very active within the Royal Society of Edinburgh itself. He was the vice president at one point. He was the convener of international affairs, in which respect he actually brokered and signed a number of agreements between the Society and other international societies, which William was just reminding me of just before we came in. And so you can actually see his signature on these pieces in the wall outside. He was also, perhaps most outstandingly, the recipient of the Royal Society of Edinburgh Royal Gold Medal, which is for outstanding lifetime achievements, which he received in 2004, only 4 years before his sadly untimely death in 5 years before, in 2009. So I think it's wonderful. It's been, when we originally thought about this project 2 or 3 years ago, it seemed like a long way away, but it's wonderful that we've actually achieved this. And many thanks to the Royal Society itself for its extremely generous contribution and for understanding what Neil meant to so many people in Scotland. So thank you. Thanks.
So thank you, sir, and thank you also to Kenny for the wonderful sculpture. Which brings us to the lecture itself. This lecture is named in honour of Sir Neil MacCormick, and previous lecturers have included Lord Patton of Barnes, Alan Little, the BBC World Affairs correspondent, Professor Mary McAleese, former President of Ireland, Professor Jean-Pierre Bourguignon, President of the European Research Council. Now, tonight's speaker is Madam Irina Bokova. She was born in Sofia in Bulgaria and has been the Director General of Unesco since 2009. She's the first woman to lead that organisation. She graduated from Moscow State Institute of International Relations and then studied at the University of Maryland and the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. She joined the United Nations Department at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Bulgaria in 1977 and was then appointed in charge of political and legal affairs at the Permanent Mission of Bulgaria to the United Nations in New York. She has worked to overcome European divisions and to foster the values of dialogue, diversity, human dignity, and human rights. As Director General of UNESCO, she's actively engaged in international efforts to advance quality education for all, gender equality, cultural dialogue, and scientific cooperation for sustainable development, and is leading UNESCO as a global advocate for the safety of journalists and freedom of expression. She's received state distinctions from countries across the world and is Doctor Honoris Causa of leading universities. Would you now welcome Madam Irina Bokova to speak on cultural cleansing, the imperative of protecting cultural heritage and diversity.
Thank you very much, Professor Burnell, President of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And allow me to say, before I make my speech, how honored I'm, Mrs. MacCormick, to be here at this particular moment of the unveiling of this beautiful ceremony. It's a big honor for me. And let me say that being here in Edinburgh and giving this MacCormick European Lecture 2016, it is not just an honor for me, but I believe it's a responsibility for a Director General of UNESCO with so many challenges that we confront nowadays in the world. And also because the lectures, the MacCormick European Lectures, bear the name of Professor Neil MacCormick, who was a man of letters and of action. And a leading, I would say, leading philosopher and a teacher, and I know that as a professor of public law and the law of nature and nations at the University of Edinburgh, he had shaped the minds of, I would say, generations of students and of scholars. But also, he was a politician and, if you allow me, a passionate European, member of the European Parliament and a man of varied, rich interests. And I believe it has been said that Sir Neil embodied the best Scottish tradition of the democratic intellect. And I'm indeed very honored to speak in this series that carry his name. And of course, it's a special honor to speak before the Royal Society of Edinburgh on a St. Andrew's Day, the patron saint of Scotland, this day to celebrate also Scottish culture. I know that the mission of the Royal Society of Edinburgh is to play a leading role in a modern enlightenment that will enable Scotland to contribute to addressing the global challenges facing humanity in the 21st century. This goal reflects the long history of the Royal Society of Edinburgh as Scotland's Academy of Sciences and Letters, embodying the spirit of the Scottish Enlightenment. The leading figures of this Scottish Enlightenment, like David Hume, Adam Smith, Robert Burns, and so many others, lit the flame of a modern humanism inspired by a profound belief in the power of reason and positive change, in the imperative of creating and sharing knowledge, in the power of history also. In the words of David Hume, a man acquainted with history may be said to have lived from the beginning of the world and to have been making continual additions to his stock of knowledge in every century. I believe these words are especially resonant today when we see violent extremists seeking to destroy heritage, to erase layers of civilization. I believe also that we need to renew with this spirit of enlightenment and craft a new humanism for these turbulent times. And this spirit, ladies and gentlemen, stands at the heart of UNESCO. Based in Paris, UNESCO was born 71 years ago in London at the Institute of Civil Engineering, presided by Miss Ellen Wilkinson, at that time Minister of Education. The idea of creating such an organization emerged as early as 1942, when London gathered regular conferences of allied ministers of education. And I always find this very inspiring, because these conferences, in the midst of the Second World War, brought together governments in exile from countries under occupation. The war was far from over. Despite everything, education was being put forward as a force for peace. And our UNESCO Constitution opens with the memorable lines that we are never tired of repeating. Since wars begin in the minds of men, and nowadays women, we say, it is in the minds of men that defenses of peace must be constructed. What an inspiring and revolutionary idea. Inspired by Prime Minister Clement Attlee, UNESCO was forged by the conviction peace can be built in new ways. In the new century, I believe this has never rung so true. I am convinced soft power is not, hard power is not enough today. We need soft power to build lasting peace. We need education. We need freedom of expression. We need intercultural dialogue. We need the power of the sciences. Because the stakes are high. Conflicts, new type of conflicts, are changing shape, and culture is moving to the front line. Culture has always been the victim of war as collateral damage, from direct targeting and looting. But what we see today is something new. It is a new in scale and nature, and this is why I have spoken of cultural cleansing, which is the title of our evening debate and of this lecture. In a recent article in The Guardian, Jonathan Jones wrote that the true age of the Vandals is not the 5th century, but the 21st century. There has never been a war on culture as systematic as that fought by ISIS, he said, and I fully agree. The Vandals and Visigoths who attacked Rome had no real desire to destroy civilization. By the 9th century, they gave rise to Charlemagne, who sought to restore and preserve Rome's heritage. The Arab invasions that brought Islam to North Africa and Spain in the 7th century, far from burning books, saved them, translating the works of Aristotle into Arabic. Of course, war has destroyed so much of humanity's shared heritage, but there has perhaps never been an aggressor so specifically and openly targeting heritage and antiquity with such a level of violence. In 2001, we all remember the destruction of the Buddhas of Bamyan in Afghanistan, ordered by the Taliban. In 2012, 11 years later, we saw violent extremists take control of the fabled city of Timbuktu and destroy the city's mausoleums and burning manuscripts. I believe all this calls for new policies and a new way of understanding why heritage matters, and I would say a new way of solidarity. This is the spirit of UNESCO World Heritage Sites, of which Scotland hosts 6, embodying the concept that heritage carries outstanding universal value. World Heritage, I have always believed, embodies this quite revolutionary and extremely humanistic idea that people of all cultures can unite around common heritage, that every single site inscribed on the World Heritage List has outstanding, and I would say, and I emphasize, universal value. This is why when a World Heritage Site is destroyed anywhere on the globe, we all suffer. We are all wounded. We are all diminished. This helps us realize we all belong to the same family. This helps us see there is no such thing as pure culture. In the walls and on the streets of World Heritage Sites across the world, we see how cultures are irreversibly intertwined, how they enrich each other, how they permeate each other. In 2012, the French news agency, AFP, interviewed a man said to be part of the violent extremist group controlling Timbuktu. There is no world heritage, the man claimed. It doesn't exist. I think this captures the challenge we face today. Since then, in Iraq, in Syria, along with the tragic humanitarian crisis, we have seen unprecedented attacks against culture. We have seen systematic violations of human rights and persecution of minorities of people on ethnic and religious grounds. We have seen the intentional destruction of irreplaceable landmarks and organized looting for illicit trafficking, and further to financing of the same extremist actions. We have seen the destructions of schools, horrendous killings of journalists, in attacks against the symbols and institutions of free thinking and creativity. And all of this, ladies and gentlemen, is part and parcel of the same deliberate strategy of cultural cleansing. Earlier this year, we confirmed the very sad destruction of the monastery of Deir Mar Elia, the Saint Elijah's, in Mosul, in Iraq. For 1,400 years, this monastery was a place of worship accepted by people of all faiths. It was leveled as part of a wider strategy that has seen Iraq's Christian population drop from 1.3 million in 2000 to 300,000 today. But this concerns not only Christians. Many other communities are affected and targeted, with Muslims carrying the heaviest burden of these disastrous attacks. These two processes, attacking people and destroying heritage, go together. Following this destruction, Father Paul Thabit Habib from Erbil, whom we know very well, he's a friend of UNESCO, said, "Our Christian history in Mosul is being barbarically leveled. We see it as an attempt to expel us from Iraq, finishing our existence in this land that dates for centuries." In 2015, the Arch of Triumph in Palmyra was blown up. Palmyra's Temple of Bel, UNESCO World Heritage Site, was destroyed by explosives. The Museum of Mosul was vandalized. The city of Nimrud, that was founded more than 3,300 years ago, and it was one of the capitals of the Assyrian Empire, and its frescoes and works are celebrated around the world, was barbarically attacked. It was, in fact, dynamited in 2015. Just last week, following the liberation of the archaeological site of Nimrud, I once again reiterated UNESCO's support to the people of Iraq to assess and possibly restore the damage inflicted. In Syria, all 6 World Heritage Sites have been damaged by fighting. 4 have been severely affected, including the old cities of Aleppo and Damascus, and we know what is happening in Aleppo in these days. In Libya, at least 8 religious sites have been damaged or destroyed. In Yemen, we have seen the destruction of the citadel of Taiz, the temple of Nakra, in Barakish and the Damar Museum. The Marim Dam and the old cities of Sana'a and Saada have been severely damaged. Across the region, illegal excavations have taken on industrial scale, helping to finance violent extremism. And let me turn to another aspect of our fight to protect heritage, culture, and I would say to prevent some of these extremist activities. The internet is another front in this struggle. Violent extremists are fueling by a global media campaign that is targeting young people to radicalize and recruit. Some 60,000 Twitter accounts support Daesh today, with an average of 1,000 followers. This campaign is high quality, multilingual, and targeted, drawing on major films, video games, music videos, and others. The siren call is alarmingly strong. The number of foreign terrorist fighters increased by 70% between mid-2014 and March 2015. Earlier this year, an estimated 30,000 foreign terrorist fighters from over 100 countries were engaged in Syria and Iraq, in Afghanistan, Libya, and Yemen. We are seeing a global campaign of hatred, division, and violence. Muslims, Yazidis, Shebaks, Assyrians, Christians, all are targeted, and all voices of peace are vulnerable. We all recall the barbaric killing of the great scholar and friend of UNESCO, Khaled al-Assad in Palmyra, the man who inscribed Palmyra into the World Heritage List and who stayed even after extremists took over Palmyra because he couldn't even imagine leaving this place. He was killed because he refused to abandon the heritage he spent his life protecting. And as the Jordanian foreign minister, a good friend also of UNESCO, he was putting it at the debate, Sameh Jude. He was putting it in a debate very recently in the United Nations when he said, "Violent extremists attack heritage because they fear the power of history to unite people, to legitimize their claims, just as David Hume implied." And I think Minister Jude is so right in putting these ideas. He further said, they attack culture because they reject the message of dialogue it carries. So ladies and gentlemen, this is my core message this evening. Culture is more than stones and bricks, more than buildings. Culture is about identities and belonging. This is about culture as a force of resilience to face adversity and to rebuild. This is why I am convinced safeguarding cultural heritage is not just a concern of experts, historians, archaeologists, of lovers of beauty and aesthetics, but it is a security and peace-building imperative. I believe we face today a new global war for hearts and minds. Violent extremists do not choose between attacks against culture and heritage and against people. They attack both. Responding calls for new ways of acting outside the cultural box. This means, first, being clear about the nature of the threat we face today. The deliberate destruction of cultural heritage is a war crime, and the International Criminal Court recently confirmed this by sentencing Ahmad al-Faq al-Mahdi to 9 years in prison for the destruction of the mausoleums in Timbuktu. This case, which was initiated by us, by UNESCO, has broken new grounds. We must stand against impunity of such crimes, and we are working in the same direction for Syria and Iraq with the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Fatou Bensouda, and the team of the court itself. We must do far more to help people understand the link between attacks on culture and attacks on people. This has been taken up by the United Nations Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights, Madam Karima Benoun, who presented a report on the destruction of cultural heritage, and this was also strongly encouraged by us. Her message echoed that of UNESCO. The destruction of cultural heritage is a human rights issue. And I think it was great that she took this idea from us in order to present it to the Human Rights Council and to have a different optics of why cultural heritage matters and why destruction of cultural heritage is so much linked to human rights. The Human Rights Council adopted a special resolution at its last session linking exactly attacks against heritage with violation of cultural rights. On this basis also, we are leading the fight against the illicit trafficking of cultural objects. And I would say that this is another huge sphere of activity based on the convention, 1970 Convention against the illicit trafficking of cultural property, that give us a very strong legal foundations to build on. In 2015, United Nations Security Council Resolution 2199 broke new ground by banning cultural trade from Iraq and Syria under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter. This, ladies and gentlemen, was a major step linking cultural issues and security matters. Tasked by the Security Council, UNESCO and Interpol, the two organizations that were mentioned in this resolution, we are supporting governments to strengthen legislation, to build capacities, to deepen information sharing and international cooperation. And already we have brought together reports from 47 member states on measures to reinforce coordination, introduce new legislation, on taking some measures depending on the state of preparedness of these countries in order to implement Resolution 2199. I think it's a huge effort and a huge success story to be shared, but we should not stop here. We have to do far more in order to lead this coalition, broad coalition of partners, including Interpol, the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, the World Customs Organization, and many, many others. With some countries, there are groundbreaking initiatives. I'm mentioning here Italy, where we have established a task force, Unite for Heritage, to bring together for the first time military and cultural professionals, educators, to intervene in situations of crisis. With the United Nations Office Against Drugs and Crime, we have launched a training program for judges and prosecutors to connect the fight against illicit trafficking with that against money laundering and corruption. With the International Committee of the Red Cross, I signed an agreement in March in order to cooperate to collect information to build capacities on the ground in places where we do not have access. There is a lot of false information about the scale of illicit trafficking, and I have to be very frank with you. We need better data and research to identify trafficking routes. This is why I'm so much pleased that UNESCO has established the UNESCO Chair on Cultural Property Protection and Peace at Newcastle University, a very recent UNESCO chair. And I'm also very pleased that the United Kingdom is so active in all of this, including through the Art Recovery Group with its database of cultural objects from Syria, scanning online platforms and auction houses to ensure none appear on the market. And we must continue to do more to strengthen coordination among law enforcement agencies, experts, museums, and auction houses. And we're working with the World Customs Organization to facilitate the identification of cultural heritage fraud and suspicious items. Just this Friday, tomorrow evening, I'm traveling to Abu Dhabi for the launch of a new international fund for the protection of heritage in armed conflict, a joint French-Emirati initiative with a major international conference on the protection of heritage in conflict, which aims to bolster international action in this area. And I would say that sometimes, of course, we are frustrated. Sometimes we are sad. Sometimes we want to do more. But all of these efforts are bearing fruit today. Governments are strengthening legislation and building capacity, and I'm determined to continue. Blood antiquities, as we call them, from Syria and Iraq, have been seized in so many places. In the United Kingdom, in Finland, in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Turkey, in the United States. And I would say that here in the United Kingdom, we have an extraordinary cooperation with the British Museum and with Victoria and Albert Museum. Let me just give one example. Thanks to the Red List of Afghanistan Antiquities and Risk, and let me just remind what these red lists are for those who are not familiar with that. Red lists that are prepared by the International Council of Museums, which supports strongly this work. And in times of crisis, the International Council of Museums is preparing these red lists, which show the prohibited items to pass frontiers in the world. And we have recently launched the red list for Syria 2 years ago in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. Recently, the International Council of Museums updated their red list for Syria. We launched it jointly together in the Louvre in France. And previously, such red list for Afghanistan Antiquities is Risk, which was supported by the Foreign Office here, gave an extraordinary example of an action, of the work in action. And the British customs officials, only at the Heathrow airport, confiscated between 2007 and 2009 3.4 tons of stolen objects, representing over 1,500 pieces. So this is an extraordinary work of the customs authorities, an extraordinary work of mobilization in order to stop the looting. And the British government, with the British Museum, returned the objects to the National Museum of Kabul. This is far more than just returning cultural objects. I think this is about rebuilding Afghan identity. This is why I went to Afghanistan for a second time this year in May. to sign an agreement with President Ghani on culture, protection of culture, and creative industries. Because the president and Afghanistan are committed to culture, they know very well the power of culture and heritage, which the president, as he told me, is not just a luxury. They know that hard security measures are not enough to build lasting peace. You need belonging, social cohesion, and national identity. You must teach young people about their history. Today in Iraq and Syria, ordinary citizens and museum professionals, what we call them the modern-day monuments, women and men, are risking their lives to protect their culture and heritage. And they need, all of them, our support. This is why, across the region, UNESCO is leading action to build capacity in preventive conservation, emergency risk management, improving inventories. And I'm determined also to integrate safeguarding cultural heritage into United Nations peace-building operations. And for the first time, at this level, culture has been integrated in the mandate of peacekeeping forces in Mali. Ahead of the current battle for Mosul, we drew up a list of heritage sites around the city and shared it with the Iraqi armed forces and all members of the global coalition against Daesh. Ultimately, we need to build the battle of ideas to respond to the poisonous propaganda of violent extremism. Violent extremists say humanity is not a single community, and we must respond. When they say diversity is dangerous, and this is a threat, we must respond by showing dialogue between cultures is a driving force of all history. In 2015, I went to the University of Baghdad in March to launch a global campaign, Unite for Heritage, to strengthen the narrative of shared values. The same goal guides all UNESCO's action to find radicalization on the internet through youth engagement, through media literacy. When violent extremists promote fear and division, we must respond with skills for critical thinking, with opportunities for civic engagement, with competencies for intercultural dialogue. I'm more than convinced no one is born a violent extremist. Violent extremists are made. They are fueled. I see this as the new frontline today and the new humanism we must nurture. Education is the way to disarm processes that can lead to violent extremism by undermining prejudices, by fighting ignorance. In November 2015, we held the first ever global conference of ministers of education on education to prevent violent extremism. This year, we launched a teacher's guide on countering violent extremism. In September, UNESCO led the first international conference on preventing violent extremism through education in New Delhi, in India, to explore draft guidelines for policymakers on preventing violent extremism through education. And this was being held in our Mahatma Gandhi Institute for Human Rights and Intercultural Dialogue. Young women and men must have resilience to refuse to be divided into us and them. This underpinned the first international conference on youth and internet, fighting radicalization and extremism, organized at UNESCO's headquarters in 2015. And this was followed just last month by a second international conference in Quebec, in Canada. This is why UNESCO is working to advance global citizenship education, another new initiative, idea, concept that we launched last year when the United Nations was preparing for adopting the Global 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development. And if you look at the goal number 4, which is about inclusive, quality, lifelong education and lifelong learning for all, with targets. One of the targets is global citizenship education. I think this is the new ideas that we need to promote. And we are working to advance this global citizenship education through a series of debates and involving policymakers, civil society, academia. And this is where the teaching of history, teaching the history of the Holocaust and other genocides, fighting discrimination today is so important. In Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Jordan, UNESCO is investing in education for young internally displaced persons and refugees because the world cannot afford to lose this generation to violence. The same spirit guides another groundbreaking project that we have, supported by the European Union, the UNESCO NetMet Youth Project, to support young women and men in 10 countries around the Mediterranean for their civic engagement, for their socially responsible behavior, and also for them to become the future leaders and the future politicians of their countries. So, ladies and gentlemen, in all of this, UNESCO is guided by a clear vision, nurtured by decades of experience. I'm personally more than convinced there is no clash of civilizations, but there is a divide, a deep divide between those who reject living together and those who believe in humanity as a single community. In too many countries, we see the rise of forces of exclusion, of hatred, and division. We see migratory crises and armed conflicts being exploited to stigmatize minorities and legitimize discrimination. We must counter these trends by redoubling our commitment to the culture of tolerance and peace. And we must remember our history. We must recall how cultures and identities have always mingled. We must highlight the extent to which cultures have been enriched by mutual exchange. This is essential to foster social cohesion and to build peace. And I believe that by doing so, we can unleash new sources of creativity and growth and build more vibrant societies. And I would say that the city of Edinburgh, your city, is a shining example as a World Heritage City, as a UNESCO Creative City for Literature, as a city hosting some of the world's greatest festivals. We see the same vibrancy across Scotland, in Dundee, UNESCO Creative City of Design in Glasgow, UNESCO Creative City of Music, in Scotland's 2 UNESCO Biosphere Reserves, in 2 UNESCO Global Geoparks, in 3 UNESCO University Chairs, including the most recent UNESCO Chair in Refugee Integration through Language and the Arts at the University of Glasgow, held by Professor Alison Phipps, a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. A recent report by the United Kingdom National Commission for UNESCO on UNESCO in Scotland estimated that UNESCO projects in Scotland generated some 11 million pounds from April 2014 to March 2015. And I'm so happy that there are a number of members of the UK National Commission for UNESCO, including James Bridge, the Executive Secretary. So I believe that this requires and needs more partnerships, more capacity, more international cooperation, more knowledge, more awareness, and I would say more commitment. This belief in the power of culture to transform and empower goes back once again to the Scottish Enlightenment. The great poet Robert Burns, whom I studied in school when I was studied in an English language school in Sofia in the 70s, the great poet Robert Burns wrote, I hope I pronounce it correctly, my teacher, who was Scottish, by the way, through the British Council, who was coming there, was trying to teach us also the old way of pronouncing. Nay man can tether time or tide. And I think this is very true today. I believe the deep message of these lines is that we must be clear about where we can contact and where we can. And where we can, we must to do so. UNESCO, ladies and gentlemen, had a great history of protecting heritage. UNESCO helped save the temples of Nubia in Egypt. UNESCO rebuilt the old bridge of Mostar in Bosnia and Herzegovina. UNESCO rebuilt Stari Mesto, the old town of Warsaw, destroyed by Nazis during the Second World War. And UNESCO rebuilt the 14th destroyed mausoleums in Timbuktu, just recently, with local leaders and communities. Wherever and whenever culture is reborn, people rise with it. I saw it 2 years ago, last year, 1 year ago, when I went to Timbuktu in July, once again in Mali, to launch the 14 destroyed mausoleums. And I saw that people were not just happy with it. I had the feeling that I was giving them back their identity. And I think this global vision of culture and heritage should be promoted because it provides us with meaning and strength to live today, to look at the past, to know the past, but also to look to the future. And I think this is our response to violent extremism. And again, I believe this is the spirit of the Enlightenment, and this is the spirit I feel is shared by the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And that is why I'm with you here today this evening. Thank you for your attention.
So thank you very much for such an inspiring talk. We have opportunity now for questions, maybe comments as well. We're a big gathering. We're going to need to use microphones. So can I suggest that if you want to ask a question or make a comment, you raise a hand. I'll direct a microphone to you, and then please ensure you hold the microphone quite close or it doesn't do any good. And if there are people in the upper gallery over Spill Room who want to ask questions, would you come to the side door of the lecture theatre and I'll recognise you from there. So, a lot of topics you've covered, also important. Where would people like to start? So we'll start with a lady about 4 rows back in the middle, near the middle.
First of all, I would like to thank you for the talk. It's very interesting, but very sad as well. And thank you for enlightening us today on what's happening, because quite often we see it in the news, but to hear this firsthand is truly moving. You mentioned about these extremists. They're destroying this heritage because they fear that history will unite the people against their ideologies. But I had a question. Don't you think perhaps there's something much more sinister than that? Is it to do with the fact that the West perhaps values this heritage more than the locals themselves? And this could perhaps be because of extreme poverty, where people are struggling to feed their children, perhaps, and therefore they don't give values to something that is 1,000 years old. And therefore you find extremist groups using this as a pretext that look at the Western, they like these sort of things, and they can travel and come and visit these kind of things. So to fight this Western, the so-called globalization, which is being driven by Western standard, it's presumed that it's being driven by Western standard and ideas. Do you think perhaps it's to do with that as well, this kind of latest destruction of heritage?
I see in your question some very interesting, if you allow me to a little bit dissect your question, because it's very interesting the way you put it. First, I think that destruction of heritage in many of these cases, and I am very frank with you, it is not because it's a Western concept. I give example once again with Mali, because I was so involved these last years with Mali, and destroying the mausoleums. Mausoleums do not represent Western value or a culture. On the contrary, it represents the true, authentic, I would say, culture that has been built by people who were living there. It's an Islamic culture. It's I would say very well inscribed in the local people, and they destroyed it because they didn't like the idea that this is not exactly this type of Islam or whatever they consider it to be, and because they wanted to disarm these people, they want to make them kind of slaves, robots. They want to deprive them of their identity, of something that is so dear to them. And that is why, because I've been there twice, I've been a week when I went with the French president, a week after the extremists, I saw this destruction, I saw the local people, their emotion. And I know very well the Imam of Djerin-Gaber, the mosque, the main mosque in Timbuktu, and I have spoken with him for a long time. I don't think this is the reason. But what you say also is very true, very important. It may be that the idea about protection of heritage started as the so-called Western idea in the 70s. But then it took such a broad recognition, and nowadays nobody can say it's simply a Western idea, because if you look at the World Heritage List, it is so diverse, it is so varied. We still want to, and there is such an ambition from so many countries. We encourage African countries to inscribe sites, Asian countries, others. I will give you an example. I went to Myanmar 3 years ago after the military junta. There was a transition period, ceded the power, and I visited some of the Pagan, which is an extraordinary place. Maybe in the audience there are people who know this country and have been there. And one of the oldest Buddhist temples were never inscribed on the World Heritage List because it was a closed country. Now we already have 2 sites, and we aspire to have more, because when a country wants to open, when there is a process of integrating, it also involves, apart from economy and all these other important trade and issues, it usually starts with history, heritage, and identity. This is the way nowadays people want to be part of this globalized world. And I see this ambition everywhere. And that is why I think it is so important to understand more why it is important to protect heritage. But the last, and I stop because your question is really extremely interesting, I would say something else. I went to Tunisia after the revolution, and this is where the changes in revolutions, or whatever we call it, in the Arab world started. We celebrated World Press Freedom Day. It was several months after we celebrate every year World Press Freedom Day, which is on the 3rd of May, and we celebrated in order to show the transition and why it is important to open a society, to have free media. We worked for their constitution, to inscribe it into the constitution. And I went to visit school. I always like to go and to engage with children in school. So I went, it was a secondary school. And the same day in the morning, I visited a museum. Maybe some of you know, Bordeaux Museum, which was attacked by extremists just 2 years ago. And I went, and there are beautiful Roman mosaics, extraordinarily beautiful Roman mosaics. And I was talking to these young school girls, and one girl raised her head and said, "You tell us that we have extraordinary heritage. Of course, there is Cartagena and the Roman, and they have so many beautiful things, and of course Islamic monuments." And I said, "You should be proud of what you have here, because you are heirs of extraordinary layers of civilization. I just come from the museum, and you have maybe more beautiful mosaics than Italians have in Rome, although they think they're the heirs of the Roman Empire." I said, "You should be proud, because this..." And a girl raised her hand, and she said, "You tell us that we have to be proud, but this does not belong to me. This does not belong to us. This belongs to another culture. This is not what we have here today." And I said, "But this is wrong. Maybe some of your ancestors has built these mosaics down there. It is not that just people move, destroy, and other cultures, they permeate each other. It is part of your legacy also. You have this, but you have also the Islamic, but then you have something else. You have, even before that, the Greeks and others." And I said, "You should understand your heritage precisely in this diverse way. If you understand this, you will understand also what diversity means today. But in order to do that, you have to teach this in schools. You have to teach young people into respecting this diversity and embracing all of their heritage they have in the different countries. There is no pure culture anywhere in the world, or pure history or something. We all are coming from different backgrounds, but you have to embrace it, to respect it, and if you do it, you understand it, you are proud of it, you will then respect the others."
Thank you. Yes, somebody centre back. Thank you, Katie.
My name is David Breeze, and I led the team which made the Antonine Wall a World Heritage Site. And I only say this because I'm used to UNESCO rules and obeying them. And one of those was that we should not restore archaeological ruins or of any period. And yet, of course, that is what you said has already happened in Timbuktu, and is what is planned for certainly parts of Palmyra, and it's again been raised in relationship to Nimrod. So we seem to be putting the one rule aside for perhaps a greater good in showing the extremists that they haven't won after all. I'd welcome your view on that.
It's another interesting question. We can have a big debate this evening. How much time do we have?
Quite a bit. We've got a reception afterwards.
It's really an extremely challenging question, and something that experts ask themselves constantly. Now, if you look strictly into the World Heritage List, we have two sites, which have been inscribed, which have been restored. And it was a very deliberate and a special debate, exceptional within the World Heritage Committee. It is, I mentioned, the Stare Miesto, the old part of Warsaw that was destroyed before the war and restored with all the precision and clarity and everything, and maybe you have been there. It's really a fine work of restoration, and it was a response to the destruction of the Second World War, and that's why the World Heritage Committee decided to inscribe. And the second is the bridge in Mostar. In fact, the bridge in Mostar was first, it did not belong to the World Heritage List when it was destroyed during the Yugoslav wars. It was restored, and the next year it was inscribed on the World Heritage List. It was a political message of giving a response to a war, to intolerance, because why this bridge? I've been several times in Mostar. It does not has have any strategic importance, this bridge. It is a bridge, more a pedestrian, I mean the cars. It was a bridge apart from the fact that, of course, it bears the architectural beauty and engineering of the Ottoman Empire, Ottomans at the times, but it did not have any strategic meaning. It was destroyed in order to say that there is no any links between the different communities, that they're not going to live together. It is precisely because they don't want to live together. And it was a message of hatred, of destruction, of war, and that is why it was restored and inscribed. And last year, we celebrated the 10th anniversary. I went once again there, a 10th anniversary of its inscription on the World Heritage List. Now, the question about restoration all over, it's still very debatable. Now, of course, you're right that the convention and the rules and the World Heritage Committee predominantly, I would say, looks at the authenticity, which is one of the criteria of the convention. But we all know that in the 90s there was an amendment, the so-called Japanese amendment, because the way, and I come back to your question whether it's a Western type of, it started like a Western type because the people at that time, experts, never thought that they will confront of a different way of building, not bricks and stones, that temples and sites can be built by wooden structures, and every 100 years, more or less, that have to be dismantled, repaired, and assembled once again, which technically was running counter the criteria of the convention. So in the 1996, the World Heritage Convention decided to allow this way of restoration work for these types. Now, whether the Bamiyan Buddhas should be restored, maybe many of you know here that there has been a long debate all this almost 15 years, 14 years since their destruction. There are those who consider that they should be restored. There are those who consider that they should not. The predominant, we organized 5 years ago, I think in 2011, a meeting of experts on the Bamiyan Buddhas, whether to restore them. And the predominant opinion of the experts knowledgeable with this was not to restore them, apart from the fact that it's extremely costly, billions of dollars, and it was considered more appropriate to still strengthen the foundations, because the background of the Buddha still need a lot more restoration in order to at least protect what exists now, and the surrounding areas to continue the archaeological excavations. The big question which we started to discuss, not finished this debate at a conference in Berlin in beginning of June this year on the protection of heritage, the Syrian heritage. We invited more than 250 experts from different parts of the world and of course, from Syria, outside Syria. The question is whether we should restore, speaking about Palmyra, for example, still an open question. First, we have not made an assessment of what is the situation there, and whether it's feasible, it's not feasible, whether we should do it, we should not do it. So still a lot of open questions, and I think this will come more and more now with what is happening in Iraq, with the advent now Nimrud, hopefully Mosul. We have to be very careful in all these areas, not to rush. I always say when the journalists ask, when are you going to start restoring Palmyra? I said, first, we have to be extremely careful about these issues, not to rush, and all this, of course, has to be done not just with prudence, but also with the thought of, I would say, on one side, the authenticity, but on the other side, let's first make this assessment and see whether it's needed or it's not needed to be done.
Yes, lady near the front on the aisle. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. Although it's not immediately the subject of your talk, I wonder, you haven't mentioned any aspect of issues around intangible heritage, and I wonder if you would like to have a word about the importance of that also.
Intangible heritage.
Intangible.
Intangible heritage. At this particular moment, we have a meeting of the Intangible Heritage Committee in Addis Ababa. And I personally think, and I'm passionate about intangible heritage because I've even chaired one of the committees in my previous capacity. When I was a permanent delegate of Bulgaria, we invited the committee in Sofia, and I chaired it. And coming back to the first question about how it starts, whether it's Western, not Western, and the others. The Convention on Intangible Heritage was considered, when it was conceived, as the so-called African Convention. Everybody thought that, well, maybe this is not that important because not very many countries will be interested in this. It is just a response because in Africa there are not that many cultural sites inscribed. But then let's look at the oral heritage, the tradition, and everything that is transmitted from a generation to generation. This is how it started. And now the intangible heritage is the fastest growing with ratifications convention in the history of UNESCO. And it is also an extremely, I would say, ambitious convention with the countries all over the world inscribing sites and, as they call, being called elements. And sometimes we tend to forget that there are two schools, that the purpose of this convention is to protect endangered heritage, intangible heritage. And it's a very opposite way of looking at the heritage. And sometimes we confront here difficulties in understanding. If the World Heritage Convention, the cultural and natural, we tend to forget it's also natural heritage. The underlying reason for inscription, and I emphasize this very strongly in my speech, is outstanding universal value, something that is important for humanity as a whole. It has a bearing, it has a message, it's something. The intangible heritage is very different. It may be just for a small community. It's just the opposite. It may be something for a very small community, something that is transmitted, and that is why we need to keep it and to protect it, to see that it does not disappear, because it will diminish the diversity of cultures. And what is the good news nowadays is a very new tendency which I strongly support and promote. Just some 10 years ago, to say that we have to look at the same time at the cultural heritage and intangible heritage was almost taboo at UNESCO. Everybody, experts, and saying, no, they have nothing in common. It's very different. They're so opposite. Nowadays, we see so much synergy. And maybe for the first time, we see all of our conventions meeting together, contributing, because the more we inscribe sites, we see the link between cultural heritage and intangible heritage. One of the biggest, I would say, projects, fascinating projects that was inscribed on the World Heritage list is the Capac Ñan. This is in Latin America, starting from Colombia, going all the way down to Chile. This is the route of Incas, the Indians. And this is an extraordinary example of cultural sites where you see villages, where you see physically the roads that have been building on the mountains, but also you go there to these villages which are there, and the first thing that they will show you, this is the intangible heritage they have, the arts, the crafts, the songs, the traditions. So this is a site inscribed, which is a mixture of tangible and intangible. And I think this is the way it should be. If we say that it's not just bricks and stones that we inscribe, but we inscribe some messages.
Thank you. Right. I think this will have to be the last question. Gentleman near you. Thank you, Alan.
Yeah, we've had a project over 40 years to build European citizenship, and that seems to be a struggle going forward. So how can we get global citizenship by 2030? You know, I mean, is there something we can learn from the European challenge to the upscaling to the global challenge?
Well, there are different examples, and some are successful, other not that successful. But we don't think that we will build until 2030. But it's a target, and I think speaking about education in the 21st century, we cannot avoid speaking about values, about what actually we want young people, young school children to come out of school. I think the lack of purpose, the lack of meaning about education, the emptying education in many circumstances of this type of values is a problem. And if we want really to instill into school textbooks, in teachers, and into quality of education this type of understanding, be it about cultural literacy, as we say, be it about environment, be it about climate change. On many of these issues, we all agree that we can succeed only if we change the mindset. And how we change the mindset, it should start very early on. It should start in the benches of schools. And I believe this is the ambition that we have, ambition of having education, educational systems, and everything that is education, having a much more open look on the world. Otherwise, I think we will not succeed in any of these ideas. We have put also education for sustainable development as also a target, something that we have been working for a long time. There was a United Nations decade of education for sustainable development in more and more education systems in the world. These elements are already included into the system, and it started with maybe something like 20-25 countries 10 years ago. Now we have more than 100 countries that have included in their education system such ideas. So this is how we see the world. And to be very frank, if you specifically tell me exactly what are these elements that make it, I cannot tell you, because we are working on this. We are constantly developing. We are convening academia, experts, and others to discuss these issues in different parts of the world. We had in India, we had in Korea, we had in Canada. We are moving in March. We will have in Ottawa also a very interesting discussion about this. Once again, we hope the Prime Minister of Canada will be there. So this is a vibrant discussion all over the world in different venues. But definitely we need to have it. Otherwise, I don't think that we will achieve what we want.
Thank you. Could I now ask Miss Diana Murray, former Chief Executive of the Royal Commission on the Ancient and Historical Monuments of Scotland, to offer the vote of thanks.
Oh, good evening, everybody. Firstly, what a fantastic lecture. And on behalf of the Royal Society and of all those attending this evening, I should like to say what a real privilege and pleasure it's been to hear your lecture tonight. In a world in which we are currently experiencing the tensions and seismic shifts created by recent political events, as well as the potential of further polarization across Europe, and population displacement in the Middle East, it is truly encouraging to hear about your leadership at UNESCO and its pledge to carry on invoking the power of culture and education in so many different ways, to unite across nations, to transform human actions, even to underpin and reinforce what it actually means to be human in the face of violence and division. And these are fundamental principles that we at the Royal Society, as well as our guests and friends here this evening, and those who will access this lecture on the website should all take to heart and support in our national and international activities. On this St Andrew's Day, we in Scotland are acutely aware of our own culture and identity, a culture which is shared and celebrated and carried in Scottish hearts worldwide. It is therefore particularly poignant to hear not just of collateral damage to physical cultural heritage, but also to intangible heritage in parts of the world which are in fierce conflict. Looting and trade in antiquities is not a new phenomenon, but the scale of the looting and the current trade far exceeds anything we've previously known, and what that trade ends up funding is truly shocking. And it can only operate because there continue to be markets for these objects once they've been through a long chain of laundering so that their provenance is disguised. I was fortunate enough to be at a session in the European Archaeology Association conference organised by Christos, I can't pronounce his name, Tsirogianni, which was held in Glasgow last year. And that particular session opened my eyes to the extent of this trade and how it operates. Christos is a forensic archaeologist working in Glasgow University Centre for Crime and Justice, who specialises in research into the smuggling networks and the markets in Western auction houses for looted artefacts. And his research is creating much more transparency around these trading routes. More research and more evidence is clearly needed, as we heard this evening, so he and I hope others will be pursuing more of this work. The prevention of such trading activity is essential on so many different levels, and the work of Unesco, led by Irina Bokova, and the initiatives that she's explained to us this evening is surely a light in the darkness and will, with international support, hopefully keep on gaining momentum. In looking up information about Irina, I found a quote from a journalist who described her as a passionate idealist, and when talking about destruction of world heritage in Syria and Iraq, her eyes flashed with determination. I think we've seen that passion and determination this evening, and it only remains for me to thank you very much indeed for your inspiring lecture, and if we may thank her again in the usual way.